Okay, this video is going to help you to learn to distinguish between active and passive voice. Active and passive voice are some of the most maybe nebulous or perhaps most confusing concepts in the English language. A lot of students are often discouraged from using the passive voice. I would say passive voice is the non-preferred version of voice. And sometimes students, although they are happy to or willing to comply with their teacher's recommendations for avoiding the passive voice and willing to use active voice, they don't really know what active voice involves or how to change their writing from passive voice to active voice. So at the end of today's and tomorrow's lessons, you should be able to feel more comfortable in being able to distinguish between sentences that use passive versus active voice, and then being able to take those sentences in passive voice and rephrase or revise them so that they use active voice when necessary. So first you're going to need to be able to distinguish between the difference in the different wordings of sentences, active versus passive. And these aren't to be confused in knowing let's say the difference between present and past tense. This is not a matter of tenses. This is a matter of looking at who is doing something within a sentence. And although this isn't really a real grammatical term, I think it will make sense if we look at the subject of a sentence in an active voice sentence and look at this active voice example and see that Megan, who is the subject of the sentence, is the doer of the guitar playing. We have Megan played the guitar. We're looking at the verb played and the subject Megan. And I'm going to write some other examples here so we can continue to see active voice examples. Continuing Megan being active, we'll have Megan. I'm going to have her verb here be drove the car. And not to give off the impression that Megan or any doer needs to be particularly active. When we're talking about active voice, the active part of an active voice verb does not need to involve someone moving or involving a lot of motion or physical activity. That's not what we're talking about when we say active voice. We could have someone being active in a more cerebral, a more passive kind of way. I shouldn't have said passive there. That doesn't make sense. But the doer in our active voice sentences our doers don't need to be moving. That is, we could have Megan. Let's have Megan. We'll say Megan. We'll have Megan studied for the test. Okay, so she's not moving there as she's studying. She's not burning calories. She is simply using her mind, and she is thinking, and still, that's an active voice sentence. Okay, because we have the doer, Megan, as the subject of the sentence. And what we have Megan doing is Megan is studying, Megan is driving, or Megan is playing the guitar. Okay, think about that for our active voice sentences. But when we look at these passive voice sentences, notice we still have Megan in the sentence, but she has moved now to a different location. We see that in these passive voice sentences, we now have a guitar as the subject of the sentence, and the doer, Megan, she's now moved to a prepositional phrase. At the end, we have the guitar was played by Megan. To continue my earlier examples, I would write a passive voice sentence like the car was driven by Megan. And even if she's not all that physically active, our passive voice sentence with Megan studying to follow that pattern is going to be, you can hear how awkward this sounds, the test was studied for by Megan. And so maybe even that construction will help you to see why that passive voice is discouraged by composition instructors who say passive voice sounds awkward and clunky and that you should strive to make your verbs active. Megan studied for the test. But maybe what you're seeing as we look at those examples, which really do express the same information, the same idea, is you're hopefully starting to see some patterns. And if we were in the classroom, I'd tell you that if you can count to 2, that you should be able to identify active versus passive voice. I'm going to write this in black rather than in yellow because it's a good enough key for you to be able to do this first exercise, and I want it to be dark and readable for you. That what we see when we have active voice is we have one word in the verb. Played, drove, and studied. We have one word verbs. But in passive voice, we have these 2 word verbs, was played, was driven, or even sometimes more than 2 words, was studied for. This is 3 words. So let's put 2 plus word verbs in passive voice sentences. And that's why in this example, before the exercise, in exercise A, you can see that because was sung is the verb, and that has 2 words in that verb, I know that those 2 words tell me why that's a passive voice sentence. My doer, just to think about why that is, my doer of the singing is not the subject of my sentence. Tiffany is not in the place of the subject. The ballad is. And so you can see that similar pattern in number 1. Janice was told by the doctor to rest. I have this 2-word verb in was told. And if I ask myself who's doing the telling, it's not Janice who's doing the telling. It's the doctor who's doing the telling. And that is called a passive voice sentence. And so I'm going to label number 1 as P, just like I can label number 2 as P. Because not only does number 2 have this 2-word verb, was puzzled, I can see another kind of pattern happening in these passive voice sentences. Maybe you're noticing this as well. These passive voice sentences have in them this prepositional phrase. I'm going to simplify and call this a by phrase. Notice we kept repeating it in our Megan sentences that were passive. But anything that I just highlighted in purple on your screen, I'm going to call a by phrase. That is a phrase that begins with the preposition by. And what that by phrase tells you in a passive voice sentence is it identifies the doer in a passive voice sentence. And so Tiffany is the one who is doing the singing in our example sentence. The doctor is the one doing the telling in our number 1 sentence. And the math problem, even though not human, is the thing or the doer of puzzling Alfredo. And that's why in number 3, we can see this 1-word verb encouraged tells us that not only do we have an active verb, the reason that it's an active verb, and we can label it as such, is that the doer of this encouraging, or doers in this case, are Polan's mother and father. They are the ones who are doing the encouraging of her.